Is Debbie Wheeler, and I'm going to be talking to you today about water and water pollution for Advanced Kentucky. First of all, take a minute to draw two pie graphs. The first should illustrate the relative amounts of fresh water and salt water, and the second should illustrate the distribution of fresh water. If you need a moment, please stop this video and then restart it when you're ready. Okay, here's an example of what you should have drawn. The oceans take up 97% of the water on Earth. The other 3% is fresh water, and of that, most is contained within ice and glaciers, about 77%. About 22% is underground water, and then less than 0.5% is our rivers, streams, and lakes. And a very small fraction is contained in the atmosphere. Okay, let's talk about a watershed. That's really important in the hydrologic cycle. A watershed is all of the land in a given landscape that drains into a particular stream, river, lake, or wetland. And the boundaries of a watershed are marked by ridges or hills. Let's take a minute to look at a diagram of a watershed. So here's our river, and it's got input from all of the surrounding hills and mountains. All these little tributaries are feeding into this river. We can see the boundary line is distinctly the ridge or the hills along the side. On this side we have one watershed, and then on the opposite side we would have a different watershed. As watersheds are carrying water into those tributaries and rivers and streams, they may carry material with them. Point sources are going to be sources of pollution that we can pinpoint. We could go right there. We can see where that effluent is flowing into the river or stream. Factories might be an example of a point source. And the non-point sources of pollution are much more dispersed. So runoff from a lawn, from a dairy farm, manure from a dairy farm, from an agricultural facility, all of those are considered non-point sources. From the roads and the streets, they're difficult to pinpoint. They come from several different areas and end up in our streams. And as they carry soil and sediment, they can increase turbidity of a stream. If they carry nutrients, particularly like manure, or leaves or grass clippings, then they can add nitrogen and phosphorus to a system, and they can increase eutrophication. You can see a diagram of that in this picture below. Okay, take a moment to write down the steps of eutrophication, and then we'll talk about them. Please stop this video to give yourself a moment to do that. Okay, let's use this little illustration to help us understand the process of eutrophication. It's going to begin with inputs from fertilizers on these lawns or from animals in the vicinity, and they're washing nitrogen and phosphorus into this waterway. The nitrogen and phosphorus are typically limiting nutrients in these environments, and so they cause a growth of algae when they're added to the system. Those algae grow, they shade one another out, and they eventually provide food for bacteria in the system. So we see a huge spike in bacterial growth in that waterway. Bacteria, remember, are doing cell respiration, and so they're going to be using a lot of the oxygen in the area and releasing carbon dioxide. And of course, that's going to cause a lot of fish to die, fish and other organisms that need oxygen as those dissolved oxygen levels plummet. Okay, so our first step, excess nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus, wash into the water from various sources. Second, algae blooms and then dies, providing food for the bacteria population. And that's our third bullet, bacteria increase and use up the dissolved oxygen in the water. And finally, we see fish and other organisms that die because of these low oxygen levels. Okay, so those are the steps of eutrophication. Okay, let's take a minute to look at a couple of other issues here, a couple of other important tests. So we have abiotic and biotic tests that we can do to determine the quality of a water source or a waterway. So nitrates, phosphates, dissolved oxygen, biochemical oxygen demand, pH, temperature, and turbidity. Those are all abiotic tests that give us some information about the quality of a waterway. And then we can look at biotic organisms as well. So fecal coliform like E. coli, indicator organisms, mayflies, stoneflies. Those are organisms that require pretty high quality water. And so when they're present, that's an indication that water quality is good, and their absence concerns us, makes us think maybe there's a problem with that waterway. Okay, here is a picture of an input from a sewage treatment plant. Say there's some sort of a flood or accident that puts raw sewage into a stream. And we want to think about what's going to happen to the biochemical oxygen demand and dissolved oxygen levels when this input occurs. And one of the first things that we see is bacteria are going to start to use oxygen in that stream, and dissolved oxygen levels are going to plummet. So we could also do a measurement of biochemical oxygen demand, and we would see that demand is high. And these are going to happen right after that input of nutrients. Now, as we get further and further away from that point source, we would see biochemical oxygen demand would go down as dissolved oxygen levels recovered. Because when those nutrients get used, the bacteria, if there's no more food there, they're going to die, and we won't have the same kind of dissolved oxygen levels later on. Okay. Let's take a minute to look at the wastewater treatment system. We're going to go through each step of the system, so make sure you've got your pens and pencils handy. All right, the first system is primary treatment. Primary treatment is a physical process. We're going to have a screen that, as effluent comes into the wastewater treatment plant, we're going to remove large objects from that stream. There's a settling tank that's going to allow material to settle to the bottom. So our grit, it's often called a grit chamber, is going to settle there. And those materials, the solids are taken to an incinerator or a landfill. The grit is typically taken to a landfill. And this stage removes 30 to 50% of all the total organic material that was brought into the system. At the same time, we may be skimming fats and oils from the surface of that stream, that waste stream. Okay, and you can see here's a bar screen. It's going to be the first system that comes into place as material flows into this wastewater treatment plant. There's our grit chamber, and so the grit chamber is going to be allowing water to settle out the grit in that system, and then we're going to go on to secondary treatment. So let's take a look at that. All right, secondary treatment is a biological process. Okay, the purpose here is to provide oxygen so the microorganisms that are naturally present in that waste stream can start to break down the nitrogen compounds and any other suspended organic material that is there. Okay, they're going to be doing cell respiration, so we're going to provide them with plenty of oxygen, and then we're going to settle out material with the sludge. This is often called an activated sludge system. So that sludge is going to end up being recycled back into our treatment plant, or it's going to be incinerated, okay, or even sent to the landfill. And here's a picture. We can see water from the primary treatment process is headed to our aeration tanks, and we've got our sludge present to do all the digestion of any dissolved material in that system. And then it'll go to a settling tank. We'll let the bacteria and any remaining material settle out. Any that we don't need we'll incinerate or compost or send to the landfill. or we might put it back into our system to continue that process. Okay. And then tertiary treatment. This isn't done in all treatment facilities, but it's a chemical or physical process that takes out nitrogen and phosphorus. Okay. So we might set up a system to promote bacterial decomposition and promote the bacteria to do denitrification to remove that nitrogen out of the water. It might be a chemical process where we add lime to precipitate phosphorus. But tertiary treatment is designed to remove one of those materials because we don't want eutrophication to happen. Okay, so you can see here's our tertiary filter as the next step to remove nitrogen and phosphorus from the system. Okay, finally, our water is eventually going to go to the nearest stream or river. So we want to make sure that any bacteria that are left in the system, and there shouldn't be very many, most pathogens are going to be taken care of at this point, but we want to make sure that any that are left are removed before that goes to a waterway. We'll use chlorine, ozone, or UV light to kill bacteria present, and then send it on its way. It's possible that we might have to, if we're using chlorine, we're going to need a long contact time, and we're going to have to remove excess chlorine with sulfur dioxide before it goes out into a waterway. Okay, so that's our wastewater treatment plant. Let's take a look together at what you know by going through this FRQ together. Okay, for your response question. All right, here's the question. Last night, the Fremont City Council, by a 4-to-1 vote, approved an upgrade of the town's sewage treatment facility. The treatment plant, which currently discharges 1 million gallons of treated wastewater into the Fremont River daily, will be upgraded from primary to secondary treatment next year. Councilperson Ramos noted that the upgrade was needed to protect the water quality of the Fremont River. A local environmental scientist, Dr. Goodwin, advised the council members that sewage treatment plants may solve a water quality problem, but they create a solid waste problem. The first thing we are asked to do is identify one component of the sewage that is targeted for removal by primary treatment and one component of the sewage that is targeted for removal by secondary treatment. Okay, I'm going to switch here and type up some possible answers. Okay, primary treatment. As you remember from our last slide, primary treatment removes large, solid material. It could be sand, gravel, human waste, etc. It could even be fats and oils are listed here as a possible primary treatment. Secondary treatment is going to remove dissolved organic materials. Okay, and that might be human waste that's dissolved in there. It could be food waste. It could be pathogens. All of those fit. And the year that this question came out, the College Board also accepted phosphates and nitrates, even though we really think of those as being tertiary treatment. Okay, let's take a look at the next question. For each of the pollutants that you identified in Part A, describe how the pollutant is removed in the treatment process. Okay, so primary treatment let's move this up a little bit so you can see it better. There we go. Primary treatment so it's going to remove any large solid objects. That might be rags, sticks, condoms, tampons, anything that you would expect to be in a sewage treatment plant. And it's going to use a grit chamber to settle out those smaller pieces. And it's going to use a physical screen. Any of those would be acceptable answers. You might also put a settling tank as part of the method of removal. And that's going to allow grit to settle as it moves very slowly through the system. Okay. And then fats and grease float at the top, and they are skimmed off. All right. Let's talk about secondary treatment and how it works. So secondary treatment, remember, is designed to remove dissolved organic material. Okay, and it can do that by encouraging microorganisms to grow. And so that means it's going to be an aerated system. And there's a couple of different ways we do that to encourage growth of microorganisms. That seems a little bit redundant the way I typed that out, but hopefully you understand that system a little bit. In the year that they gave this question, they also allowed you to talk about pathogens being removed via the disinfection process, which, as we mentioned before, chlorine or ultraviolet rays or ozone. Those are all the ways that we remove that. And they also let you mention what was done via what's considered tertiary treatment. So if you said phosphates and nitrogen in that earlier question in part A, here in part B, you might say, you know, phosphates are removed via lime. Or you could say that the nitrates via denitrifying bacteria. And that's typically in an anaerobic environment, an environment without oxygen. Okay, so now we've answered parts A and B of this question. Let's take a look at part C. Explain how sewage treatment plants create the solid waste problem that Dr. Goodwin mentioned in the article. Okay, so there's a couple of different approaches that we can make with that. All of the material, and I'm actually going to go back to a slide. So this sludge material is creating, and so is the grit, and so is the material, the large that we removed, is creating solid waste that we somehow have to remove from the system. Okay, and that's all we actually have to do is just, you know, explain in each one of those systems, primary and secondary treatment, you've got solid material that somehow has to be dealt with, and that's it. Part D. 2 common methods of disposing of solid waste from sewage treatment plants are transporting it to a landfill or spreading it onto agricultural lands. Describe an environmental problem associated with each of these methods. Okay, let's pick landfill first. So in a landfill, it's going to take up space. I mean, that's one of the main issues. Landfills, as we know, also have problems with leaking and then contaminating groundwater. and the material in there, you know, could be heavy metals or other toxins. And remember that material that leaks is called leachate. I'm going to put that up here just so you can remember. That's what that word leachate means. So that's one of the problems they can pose. Methane is also released by landfills as material decomposes in an anaerobic environment. And then there are some environmental effects with the transporting of material. I mean, it's going to be transported in a vehicle that probably is using fossil fuels. And so you can think about all the, or you can write about, if you're answering this question, you can write about all the effort that goes into, you know, mining for that, or sorry, drilling for that petroleum. And then when we burn it in a vehicle, we're releasing carbon dioxide, contributing to climate change. Okay. If that solid material ends up on agricultural lands, it has its own set of issues. Okay. We don't want pathogens from human waste contaminating food products. So that's a problem. There's also potential groundwater contamination. From, you know, heavy metals. And that's one of the reasons that in many states they don't allow the material from wastewater treatment plants to be used on agricultural lands, because if that material is coming from a university or something of that nature, we just can't guarantee that it doesn't have heavy metals in it. So that's an issue. And so not just groundwater, but if they have those heavy metals in them, you know, they could end up, ooh, where's my cursor? I guess we'll start a new window. Sorry about that. Okay, so heavy metals could end up in the food chain if they're applied to the land. You know, with the sludge, they can end up in the food chain. Okay, and then if those materials are high in nutrients, and that's actually the benefit to applying them, but those nutrients may end up in streams if they wash off the field. And then remember, high levels of nutrients can lead to eutrophication. Okay, I think we've adequately answered part D. Let's read part E. The final step in sewage treatment is disinfection. Identify one pollutant that is targeted during disinfection and identify one commonly used method of disinfection. All right, let's take a look at that. So, pollutants. I mean, we're talking about pathogens primarily. So disinfection targets E. coli bacteria. So that would be one that we could mention. You could also just say coliform bacteria. Remember that E. coli are a type of coliform. Cholera is a waterborne pathogen. Viruses Any of those would work. Okay, and then one method of disinfection, we talked about 3, and hopefully those are right on the tip of your tongue. Chlorine, ozone, and ultraviolet radiation, which I've been calling UV rays, or sorry, not rays, but UV. They are actually UV rays that are coming out of the lights that are used on the water. I think that answers that question completely. Pretty straightforward. The last part, part F, identify one United States federal law that requires monitoring the quality of the treated sewage that's discharged into the Fremont River. Okay. All you have to do is identify that law. So that's pretty simple and straightforward to do. The Federal Water and Pollution Control Act is one that you might have chosen. One that I go over with my students, because you can't memorize all of the laws, you just need a few in your toolbox, is the Safe Drinking Water Act. And the Safe Drinking Water Act basically is going to include the protection of drinking water sources. And remember that we're discharging the material from our wastewater treatment plant into the nearest stream, which is going to be a drinking water source for the community that's downstream. So that's a good one to include. Okay. Let's look at a couple of questions together just to review what we've done. So I'll try and put my picture up here as we talk. Which of the following is an effective alternative to chlorine for disinfecting wastewater in a municipal treatment plant? And hopefully, after all the times we've mentioned it, you remember ozone. All right. If wastewater treatment plant effluent that contains nitrates and phosphates is allowed to flow into a body of water, which of the following may result? Hopefully you picked out eutrophication pretty quickly. Remember, when you're approaching a multiple choice question, read the question, come up with an answer in your head, and then read the choices and see if that answer is there. And that's a good way not to get tripped up by maybe words you haven't heard before or that seem confusing. All right, which of the following components of a wastewater treatment plant is designed to facilitate the decomposition of organic material by aerobic microorganisms? That word aerobic made me think about oxygen, and I remember that secondary treatment is all about, encouraging oxygen, because I want those microorganisms to digest that dissolved organic material. Bar screen and grit settling tank, that's not secondary. That happens, that's primary treatment. Activated sludge, yeah, I'm pretty sure that's it. Chlorination and UV, sorry, you can't read the rest of that. UV light array tank. Those are both involved in disinfection, so I'm picking C. That's got to be the right answer. Which of the following is true of sewage treatment plants in the United States? Okay. They release wastewater before solids are removed from the sewage. No, that's actually the first part of primary treatment, so I know A is not true. They use stormwater runoff to assist in the treatment process. That's interesting. Most systems are designed not to include stormwater runoff because it really increases the amount of water going into the system and makes it hard to treat. So that's an old thing to incorporate sewage and stormwater, and most cities have to separate them. Let's look at option C. They are not designed to remove pharmaceutical chemicals from the wastewater. That's absolutely true. So it's been in the news, birth control pills, heart medicine, all of that stuff really is just going back into our water systems to be taken up by the next community. They are not designed to be removed from our sewage treatment plant. D, they have largely eliminated cultural eutrophication in major waterways. No, because they're not treating the runoff from our streets and just directly from the streams that are going in there. They release wastewater not regulated by the Clean Water Act. Actually, the wastewater that they release is regulated by the Clean Water Act. So C is our best answer. Okay, let's talk real briefly about water treatment and then we will wrap it up. Water treatment is much more simple compared to wastewater. Basically, you've got a settling tank that is going to settle out a lot of the material coming in. The raw water has a lot of sediments in it. That process, before it gets to the sediment tank, though, is going to be sped up by adding alum. Alum is aluminum sulfate. It has a positive charge. And remember, soil is by and large negatively charged particles. And so you produce a flock that, is kind of a dense group of material, and that will settle out quite quickly. And so this is the very first way we reduce turbidity significantly as soon as it comes into the water treatment plant. Next, it's going to go through a filter. It's usually sand. There may be some carbon in there to get rid of any smell, to filter out any dissolved material that hasn't already been taken care of by the alum. And then, back up one. And then it's going to go to a disinfection chamber, and we're going to do chlorine. We can do chlorine, ozone, or UV lights here. We're going to add fluoride at some point. And then we're going to store it. And we may need some sort of corrosion control involved in that process. So fairly straightforward, a little bit different than our wastewater treatment plant. So take a moment, go ahead and pause this video to put step P, Q, R, and S in the right order. Okay, so the first step is going to be adding our flocking agent, which is alum. And so we're only going to look at the choices that start with S. The next thing we need to do is let those particles settle out. I'm going to start with P. We're going to pass it through a screen to remove debris. And that often happens at the river itself. The river is they're going to have screens there to remove debris, but it may happen depending on the facility right when they come in. So let's look at P as first, S as second, and then our settling will happen out next, and Q has to be the end step. So this right here, P, S, R, and Q, those are the steps. Okay, thanks for sticking with me through the whole presentation. I hope it was helpful, and good luck in May.